Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Jennifer Rothschild and I'll be your host for today. I am a part of the Educating Character Initiative, which is a project of the Program for Leadership and Character at Wake Forest University. One of the goals of the ECI is to help equip faculty, staff, and administrators at colleges and universities to do the work of educating character. So this series is part of that goal. This meeting is the third session in our 5-session webinar series on how to educate character in the university. Before we get to our session for today, our topic and our speaker are very exciting, but I'm going to make you hear about some events first before we get there. Some more events that are coming that are related to the same goal of equipping us to do this work. We do have 2 more sessions in this series. We'll reconvene next month for the 4th session in how to educate character in the university with a session on civic virtues. And then in June, we'll have a panel session on how to educate character across differences. We're also co-sponsoring a 2nd webinar series with the Jubilee Center, in which each session shines a spotlight on one excellent character program. They're around the world, the different sessions. And, as those of us who do this work know, sometimes having a great example to look at is the thing that helps bring it into focus for what it is we do and don't want to do at our own institutions. So those are really nice ways into the work as well. We have 2 more sessions in that series, one in May with folks from the Ivy Business School and another in July with the University of Navarra. 2 other ECI-related things. We are accepting applications for a faculty development workshop. It's taking place in July. You only have a week left to get the applications in. And that workshop is for faculty on how to integrate character into your existing courses. It's not discipline specific, whatever your field. Come on in and learn a little bit about that with us. And last but not least, we have our major conference that we're putting together in December on the topic of character across differences. We have an open call out for that, so please submit your abstracts for presentations. We're hoping for traditional papers, but also for proposals to lead workshops on how to do character work so that we can all learn from you. More information about all these events is available on our website, where you'll also be able to register for the ECI community so that you don't miss out on any of the great things we have happening. Okay, enough of all that. Our format for today will be that we'll first hear from our speaker, and then afterward we'll have some time for Q&A. There is a Q&A button below where you can leave your questions. That should be active from the start, so you can leave questions during the presentation or after it's completed. And with that, let's get to why you really came here today, which is to hear from our speaker. Jason Baehr is the professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University. He works in epistemology and virtue theory, in a combination that's led to numerous important contributions in conversations about virtue epistemology, on intellectual virtues. His publication record is long. I will just mention his most recent book entitled Deep in Thought, A Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues. This is a must read for anyone interested in character education. I was telling him right before this call that just last week I was speaking with someone on a call who built an entire program university-wide around this book of his. And as a bonus, I promise it's not a piece of fussy philosophy, but it's quite accessibly written. So here to talk to us about teaching for intellectual virtues, integrating character education with academic teaching and learning, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Jason Baehr.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jennifer. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm a big supporter and very excited about all the things going on at Wake Forest related to character and virtue education. And thanks to those of you that are joining us online for taking some time out to think about some of these things. I'd like to begin with a pair of questions, a couple things for you to reflect on and consider. And as you reflect on these things, don't try to get the right answer by thinking about what the theme of this session is necessarily. Just share, if you would, what comes immediately to mind. So the first question is, think about someone that you consider very smart, very intelligent. Bring to mind someone who you consider just a paragon of smarts and intelligence. And then think for a moment about what are the characteristics, or what are the qualities, or what is it in virtue of which you regard them as very, very smart or very intelligent. Second question. Now imagine someone who you consider to be deeply good and admirable as a person. When I say really good person, so-and-so is a really good person, who comes to your mind? And again, let me ask you, in virtue of what do you consider them to be such a good or admirable person? I'd like to do two things. First thing I'd like to do is draw your attention to a dimension of personal character that lies between some of our ordinary ways of thinking about good character, or what it is to be a good person, on the one hand, and certain ways of thinking about what it is to be smart or intelligent, on the other hand. Now, a lot of your descriptions of intelligence actually fall within this dimension of character that I'm going to draw your attention to, so I'm not probably going to be drawing your attention to something you haven't thought much about before. But nevertheless, I think you'll see that this dimension of character that I want to talk about, it's not quite the same thing or identical to how we normally think about character and virtue. It's got something to do with how we think and our intelligence, but then it's not identical to how we often think about what it is to be smart or intelligent either, which we often associate with things like knowing a lot or having certain natural gifts or aptitudes. And then the second thing I'd like to do is say a bit about how we might teach in a classroom setting with an eye to forming the intellectual character of our students. And I won't be talking about sort of directly teaching that material. I'll be talking about how can we teach academic content and skills with an eye to a certain kind of character formation on the part of our students. So I will with that introduction, I will go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Hopefully that looks okay to you. So I want to begin with a couple of quotations from Martin Luther King Jr., both or all of which are from his book, or excuse me, his essay, Love in Action. And pay attention as I read these to a kind of dichotomy or distinction he's suggesting between the heart and the head, or the will and the intellect. So he says, one day we will learn that the heart can never be totally right if the head is totally wrong. Only through bringing together of head and heart, intelligence and goodness, shall man rise to a fulfillment of his true nature. And he says, we must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. The broad education will therefore transmit to one not only the accumulated knowledge of the race, but also the accumulated experience of social living. So notice that distinction between intelligence and character, or intelligence and goodness. You might get the impression from what he's saying that he thinks of these as divorced, or importantly complementary, but different at least. However, when he goes on to say what he means by intelligence, we get a richer and even a more characterological picture. He says, neither is this to say that one must be a philosopher or possess extensive academic training before he can achieve a good life. I know many people of limited formal training who have amazing intelligence and foresight. The call for intelligence, I might insert parenthetically here, is not a call for having a lot of knowledge or having certain innate intellectual abilities or talents. The call for intelligence is a call for open-mindedness, sound judgment, and love for truth. It is a call for men to rise above the stagnation of closed-mindedness and the paralysis of gullibility. One does not need to be a profound scholar to be open-minded, nor a keen academician to engage in an assiduous pursuit for truth. So the suggestion here is that there's a kind of intelligence that's marked by things like a love of truth or open-mindedness, sound judgment. We might add qualities like inquisitiveness, intellectual humility, intellectual courage. And that's the dimension of character that I'd like to spend a little time talking about. So a quick and rough definition would be that intellectual character, which is what we can call this dimension of character, intellectual character consists of how we are disposed to act, think, and feel in a distinctively epistemic context, in a context where at least part of what we're trying to do is get to the truth, or learn, or acquire knowledge, or assess evidence. So our intellectual character expresses itself in how we act, think, and feel in that kind of domain. And of course, that's not to say it's not also a social domain, because often pursuing knowledge is social, and often we pursue knowledge for social reasons or social benefits. But what marks intellectual character is that it's the part of our character that is epistemically oriented. We can think of intellectual virtues then as strengths or excellences of intellectual character. And we can think of intellectual vices as weaknesses or defects of intellectual character. So King mentioned open-mindedness or love of truth. I also added something like curiosity or inquisitiveness, intellectual humility, intellectual courage. He mentioned the vice of gullibility. We might also think of intellectual arrogance or laziness. I think he also mentioned closed-mindedness. To give you an even finer grain view of what intellectual virtues look like and might involve, I want to share with you, sorry, this is a very small type here, a list of virtues that are central to a school that I helped found a little over 10 years ago called the Intellectual Virtues Academy of Long Beach. And at this school, they focus on 9 virtues in 3 different categories. The first category consists of virtues that are aimed at getting the learning process started and headed in the right direction. So curiosity, disposition to ask thoughtful and insightful questions is key. But then in the learning process, we also need to know how to think for ourselves, form our own judgments. And so we need intellectual autonomy. At the same time, and in that context, we need to have an awareness of what we don't know and of our intellectual limitations. So we need our autonomy balanced by our intellectual humility. The next group of virtues are virtues that sort of keep the learning process on track. Attentiveness is a virtue that has to do with really showing up, personally showing up, being personally present in the learning process, not just in body, but in mind and attention and focus and emotion as well. Intellectual carefulness is about getting things just right and about avoiding potential mistakes or errors. Where thoroughness would be a matter of going deep, probing for understanding, making connections between ideas, giving and searching for explanations. Another pair of kind of complementary virtues there, carefulness and thoroughness. The last three virtues on the list are virtues that are, as it were, designed to help us overcome certain familiar obstacles in the learning process. One of those obstacles is a kind of rigid or narrow-minded thinking. Plenty of research that shows that we often have a hard time thinking outside of or giving serious consideration to views or perspectives that are different from ours, and that can impede our thinking and our learning. And so open-mindedness is a virtue that helps mitigate that tendency. Similarly, and I certainly find this with my students, one of the things that can limit their intellectual growth and learning is fear. Fear of failure, fear of speaking up and looking foolish in front of their peers. And that's why intellectual courage would be an important virtue, because it helps us hang in there and persist in the context of fear or risk. And then similarly, intellectual tenacity helps us overcome the tendency to quit or to avoid doing work or thinking that's difficult. It helps us hang in there in the context of intellectual struggle. So these aren't the only intellectual virtues, but they're just as several that at the school we've taken to be kind of fundamental and important. Hopefully they give you a kind of fine-grained, somewhat richer and more specific grasp of the strengths of intellectual character that we need in order to think and learn well. Now I want to turn to this idea of trying to educate and teach for intellectual virtues. And I want to begin by just noting two concerns that one sometimes hears or reads about when it comes to this idea of character education. One of these is a practical concern. I think a lot of teachers might balk at the idea of trying to implement character education because they feel like, I don't have time. Right? I'm tasked, my job, I'm tasked with getting through a certain amount of knowledge and content area and helping students develop certain disciplinary skills over the course of the year or semester. I don't have time to add an emphasis on intellectual or character development to what I'm already doing. And then some might have kind of principled resistance to the idea of character education, where the worry might be, well, who am I to decide what virtues or character my students should develop? I'm just here to train them to think well, to impart knowledge and skills. It's not my place to educate for character. Now, I do want to be very clear about one thing, which is that I think there are very good rebuttals to both of these concerns, even for someone who's thinking about character in, say, moral or civic terms. So I don't think that these worries or concerns are in any way decisive, even if we're thinking about educating for civic virtues or moral virtues in an educational context. But what I do want to point out is that where our focus is on intellectual character or intellectual virtues, these concerns have very little traction. So the first thing to point out, and as I'll go on to explain and hopefully illustrate in a few minutes, educating for intellectual virtues is not primarily a matter of teaching people about those virtues. It can be useful to have the language and the concepts, but we educate for intellectual virtues primarily through teaching for knowledge and skills. It's not an alternative to teaching for knowledge and skills. It's a way of approaching some of these more familiar and traditional academic activities. And then secondly, on the concern about it's not my place, or are we importing values in education that aren't supposed to be there? Again, I don't have any problem with I think education is always value laden. But again, if we're thinking about intellectual virtues, I'll just note that there are probably very few educators or administrators who would deny that it is our place as educators to help inspire in our students and grow in our students qualities like curiosity or open-mindedness, intellectual autonomy, humility, carefulness, and thoroughness. After all, these really are just the qualities of excellent thinkers and learners. And certainly education should be about, if among other things, promoting and fostering good thinking and good learning. So I think either of these concerns about character education have especially low traction, where the idea is where what we're thinking about is educating for intellectual character or for intellectual virtues. The takeaway then would be that the construct or very idea or framework of intellectual character and intellectual virtues suggests a very natural and feasible, not terribly taxing or time-consuming way of integrating academic instruction with teaching for character and virtue. This is an especially easy or natural or organic way to do both at the same time, to teach for knowledge and skills while also trying to form the character and grow virtues in our students. So what might this look like in practice? This is a much bigger question than I can address in any detail right now. But I will try to say just a few things. I want to focus on 3 things that we can do in a classroom setting. And I'm thinking that this applies at the university level, but it also applies K-12 as well. 3 things we can do to teach for intellectual virtues in a classroom setting. The first, and I think probably most important, though not by itself a kind of sufficient or silver bullet strategy, but really essential, is to create frequent and well-supported opportunities for our students to practice these virtues that we're trying to form in them. And in the background here is just the idea that every intellectual virtue, and I think this is true of moral virtues and civic virtues as well, but each intellectual virtue has a characteristic activity or skill. And it's generally the kind of thing that you'll see in the definition of the virtue. So open-mindedness, for instance, is about, involves the competence or skill of considering multiple perspectives. That's something we can practice. We can practice taking up different perspectives, inhabiting them, giving them a fair and honest hearing. Curiosity involves the skill of asking thoughtful and insightful questions. We can get better at asking questions through practice. Similarly, intellectual humility involves a kind of an appropriate attention to and a willingness to admit to ourselves or to others our intellectual limitations or mistakes or the gaps in our knowledge or the limits of our evidence base. So each virtue has a characteristic skill. And of course, one of the ways that we develop skills is through practicing the associated activity. So you might ask yourself, for each of your target virtues, so let's say that you're interested in helping your students grow in curiosity and intellectual humility. For each of those virtues, you might ask yourself, do I provide my students with frequent opportunities to practice the skills that are characteristic of these virtues? And I think a lot of us do already regularly provide opportunities for students to practice virtues like intellectual carefulness and intellectual thoroughness. But I think it's worth asking, how often do we give them opportunities to grow their curiosity or their intellectual humility or their intellectual courage? So if we want students to grow in particular virtues, if we want to help encourage their growth in certain virtues, we need to identify the skills proper to those virtues and then begin to think about, am I creating frequent opportunities for my students to practice the skills associated with those virtues, to practice formulating good questions, considering alternative perspectives, struggling and persisting, taking intellectual risks, admitting their intellectual limitations, and so on. And no less important, I think we need to ask ourselves, are we providing the scaffolding and feedback necessary for making the most of these opportunities? So often students need instruction and help. They need to know what counts as a good question or not. How can we best consider multiple perspectives? When should we do that? When is too much? So students need some support and some scaffolding in their practice of these virtues. And then they also benefit from feedback about their performance. So are we creating opportunities for our students to practice these virtues? Are we supporting them well in that context? And are we providing them with helpful feedback that they can use to guide and inform and adjust their practice? So this is somewhat abstract. I do think that what these opportunities look like for each of us will depend to some extent on what we teach and, of course, the level at which we teach. But just as something a little bit more concrete, I'll mention some work on what are called thinking routines. This has come out of work at Harvard's Project Zero, which is a kind of education collaborative research institute. And several researchers there have done a lot of work on thinking routines, which I'll describe as follows. This isn't always this isn't the exact definition they give, but it's faithful to how they're thinking about these things. We can think of thinking routines as structured thinking exercises. Typically, they just have a few steps, don't take that long to engage in. Structured thinking exercises that can be used frequently and across subject matters to elicit the practice of intellectual virtues. So they're thinking exercises or protocols that can be used repeatedly across different subject matters that create space or opportunities for students to wonder, to think outside the box, to acknowledge the limitations of their perspectives, to see connections and make connections between different ideas. So to practice the virtues that we've been talking about. And to give you a rough idea of what some of these involve, here are three. And you kind of get the idea of what each one might involve just from the name. So claim, support, question is where you'd have a student formulate a claim and then go on to formulate support for that claim, and then go on to generate questions that someone might raise about the claim. And of course, this could be used in any number of different contexts and subject matters. And it gives students opportunities to practice virtues like autonomy, because they have to formulate their own opinion or claim, carefulness, thoroughness, and curiosity. Another widely used thinking routine is called see, think, and wonder. And this, as the name suggests, it could be used. It could be used looking at an artifact, at a painting, but also at a definition or a table or a graph. I did this or some version of this the other day in a logic class I'm teaching, where I had them sort of step back and look at a proof and then go through some of these steps. The first step is students just observe. Don't evaluate, don't interpret, just observe. What do you see? And then what does what you see make you think about? What comes to mind as you focus on what is observable or perceivable to you? And then third, what does what you're thinking make you wonder? What do you wonder about? So again, built into this routine, which can be used frequently and in many different contexts, is an opportunity to practice virtues like attentiveness, autonomy, and curiosity. The last thinking routine is circle of viewpoints, where you deliberately identify and then explore or individually take up different perspectives on a given topic or theme or event, which creates structured opportunities to practice virtues like open-mindedness, humility, and curiosity. There are dozens of thinking routines. You can go to the Project Zero website, and they have a thinking routines toolkit that's very useful. But the advice from these researchers is to just pick a couple, maybe a couple or a few thinking routines that you can get comfortable with and use frequently. And I'll say at the Intellectual Virtues Academy, one of the most distinctive features of the educational program is how widely used these thinking routines are. Students just know how to use them, a variety of them immediately, and it just immediately puts them into a mode of practicing these virtues. Okay, so we can create opportunities for students to practice these virtues. However, if the environments or the ethos or the culture of our classroom doesn't align with these practices, then their effect is likely to be minimal. So a second thing we need to think about is creating classroom environments that are conducive to the practice and growth of intellectual virtues. And I think there are at least a couple of dimensions to this. One, it requires paying very close attention to and nurturing a positive relational environment in the classroom. When teaching for character of any sort, we're really trying to reorient students in a deep way. We're trying to impact them at the level of some of their deepest beliefs and values and dispositions. And students are going to be more likely to undergo and to be open to that kind of reorientation when they feel like they are in a caring and respectful environment. So we need to ask, what are the norms? What are the expectations? What are the protocols in our classes? How are we oriented toward our students? Do we put a premium on the quality of relationships between us and our students in as much as we can control that, and between the students themselves? A related point has to do with the norms and incentive structures that are kind of built into the classroom environments that we create, whether intentionally or not. So a couple of norms and things that we incentivize in many of our classes are getting right answers and getting those answers quickly. And right answers are important. Sometimes efficiency is important, but those shouldn't be the only thing that we value and incentivize. So we might wonder, how am I incentivizing wondering? Do I incentivize the taking of risks in my class, of being willing to try a problem or answer a question even when they don't really might not know the answer? Do we incentivize, do we explicitly and implicitly value a willingness to struggle, to take risks, to wonder, to probe for deeper understanding, to ask for help, in addition to valuing getting things right and doing so in an efficient manner? I think a helpful kind of thought experiment here is to step back and ask yourself how you think your students would answer the following questions. And on what basis? What would their evidence be for this? Do I feel respected and cared for in this class? And then secondly, what does my professor really value? Educationally, pedagogically, what are my teachers' values? And of course, the answers that we come up with probably will say something about the environment that we're creating in the classroom. But again, these efforts to give students opportunities to practice these virtues, I think, can't be successfully pursued outside of attention to the classroom environment that we're creating. But then neither is a conducive classroom environment a substitute for giving them opportunities to practice the various virtues. The third and also kind of obviously important thing that we need to do if we are trying to promote our students' intellectual character growth is to authentically model the virtues that we are trying to promote with our students. John Dewey has a couple of nice quotes along these lines from his book, How We Think. He says, "Example is more potent than precept, and a teacher's best conscious efforts may be more than counteracted by the influence of personal traits which he is unaware of or regards as unimportant." Ugh, that's inspiring and challenging. But it suggests that these efforts that I'm talking about aren't just a matter of what I do or what I have my students do. Their success is also a matter of who I am and of the qualities of mind that I spontaneously and authentically model for my students. Similarly, he says, everything the teacher does, as well as the manner in which he does it, incites the child to respond in some way or another. And each response tends to set the child's attitude in some way or other. I think that's an insightful and kind of profound way of describing a kind of communication and influence and education that goes on between us and our students that's independent of whatever it is we might be talking about, and independent of the sort of disciplinary content that we're engaging with. So again, very important to be modeling these virtues for our students. I want to share with you a quote that's included in my book. It's a quote from conversation with a former president of my university, Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And he was telling me the story of having shown up at Harvard for graduate school. And one of the first seminars he took by a world expert in the focus of the seminar. And he said at a certain point, a student of his, or a classmate of his, asked the teacher a question, and the professor just spontaneously and comfortably responded with, "I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I'll have to look it up and get back to you." And here's how he reflected on that experience and that the impact that professor's modeling of, in this case, intellectual humility, the way that the professor's modeling of intellectual humility had a deep impact on this person. And as I read this, I'd encourage you to pay attention not just to how this experience inspired intellectual humility on Father Lawton's part, but also how it led to the practice of other virtues, other intellectual virtues as well. So he says, "It was the first time I could remember a teacher saying, 'I don't know.' And this man was one of the leading scholars in the world. From then on, I began to feel that it was all right not to know." What a gift to be able to give our students. The gift of them feeling like it's okay not to know, that they don't need to pretend to know what they don't know. I no longer had to pretend to know. From then on, and this is where some of the other virtues start to creep in, From then on, I began to think things through, thoroughness and autonomy. I wanted to know not what someone else thought, but what I thought. Again, wonderful description of intellectual autonomy. I realized it was okay to be wrong for a time while searching for the truth. Of course, this was just the beginning of the journey, but it had begun. The fact that I still vividly remember these moments some 50 years ago, some 50 years later, shows how powerful these moments were. I think we all know from our own experience, probably more so as students than as teachers or educators, the power of an example. And I think if your experience is anything like my own career trajectory was due in no small part to the way that certain teachers modeled certain intellectual virtues powerfully and organically. So those are three things that we can do in a classroom setting. We can create opportunities for students to practice specific virtues. We can create classroom environments that are supportive and conducive of those opportunities. And then we can model intellectual virtues for ourselves. So here are some questions that I'll leave you to ponder. Which virtues do I want to encourage in my students? This is important. You need to develop a specific focus. You can't teach for every intellectual virtue at once. It's worth trying to get specific, identify some target virtues. Secondly, how can I provide my students with frequent, well-supported opportunities to practice the specific activities or skills characteristic of these target virtues? And chances are you already do this to some extent. And certainly you do for certain virtues. So maybe begin by thinking of ways that you already provide these opportunities, and then think about how you can improve those opportunities or create additional opportunities. Third, how can I align the relational environment and incentive structures of my courses with this aim of nurturing students' practice and growth in these qualities? And then finally, do I authentically model these virtues for my students? What does that look like? How could I maybe improve my modeling of these virtues? Well, that is it. So thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. That was great. For anyone here who has a question, you can enter it into the Q&A box, and I will deliver those questions to our speaker. Let me start here with where you were just ending off. You mentioned, so a couple of things at the end that were really interesting that I think I was thinking about together. One is, so you mentioned this thought, well, you can't educate for all of them. You can't do everything, so pick something. And then the other, when you were giving your example about the comfort of saying, of seeing someone really smart say, I don't know, you mentioned that, teaching for some intellectual virtue opens on to others.
Yeah, right.
And so I was thinking about that, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about, what do you think, is there something to say about the relationship amongst the intellectual virtues? And relatedly, are there some that are more important than others? So given that you can't do all of them, do you have some thoughts about which ones are best to shoot for first?
Yeah, great questions. On the first point, I'll say, though I think it's important to try to focus on some specific virtues, I do think these virtues are intimately related with each other, so that the exercise of one often demands at least some exercise of another. So I don't think they can be practiced to a very great extent in ways that are wholly independent of each other. But I think my point there is more about it was more about sort of the focus of the instructor, and that if we're going to sort of try to create more opportunities for our students to practice these virtues and so on, it can be helpful to, we can only think very specifically and concretely about so many virtues, at least to begin with. So start small, pick a few things. But yes, I think what you'll find is that the way you talk and the way you encourage your two or three virtues will, if you're paying attention, also lead you into the territory of several others. So I'd say be prepared for that. And then remind me of the second question.
So it was
Second part
just
of your
how do you
question.
fit together, and are there some that are more important than
Oh,
others?
some more important than others. Yes. I mean, I do think that depends on a lot of different factors, like your own discipline. So I think that in certain disciplines, some virtues are going to be foregrounded more than others. I would also say that it depends to some extent on who your students are, where they're at developmentally, or even certain aspects of their own cultural or other forms of identity. So there might be certain contexts, for instance, where it's very important to focus on the virtue of intellectual humility. For instance, if you're with students who are more inclined towards something like intellectual arrogance or something like that, right? Or a sort of hyper sort of concern for success, helping them like calm down and realize it's okay not to know everything. It's okay to not be perfect might be really important. Whereas you might have a different group of students where humility is not the first thing that they need to be thinking about, right? They might benefit educationally with a greater emphasis on something like intellectual autonomy or intellectual courage. So I think it depends on who our students are, what subject matter we're teaching, and other factors like that. I mean, I will say, having made all of those qualifications, um, in my experience, curiosity, intellectual courage, curiosity because students can be passive and we want them to actively wonder. Courage because they tend to be paralyzed, many of them at least, by fear, which holds them back and keeps them sort of in that passive mode. Those are two virtues that I think are really important. I also just have found intellectual humility to be very valuable, for precisely the sort of reason that quote illustrated, incentivizing, uh, praising, encouraging students, um, encouraging them to admit when they need help, to admit when they don't understand something. I find that really, really valuable too. So those are a few thoughts.
Nice. So we have one of the features of ECI is we have a very diverse bunch of institutions that are part of a community. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you think about, I mean, you were just touching on this a bit, how you tailor what you do to particular institutions, or how do you view the moving parts, or are there particular principles that you would use in taking these guiding thoughts and putting them to particular use? So, for example, maybe one of them is based on what you were just saying, you think about the weaknesses in
Yeah.
your population of students and then sort of try to work against those. Is that something that you would recommend, or do you have similar principles like that you think, okay, when you want to tailor it to your group of students, here's how you think about it?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that putting a high priority on the needs and strengths and limitations and identity of the students is really important. Institutional considerations can be relevant as well. So I teach, for instance, at a Jesuit university where there's a long history of Ignatian pedagogy and Ignatian spirituality, which is very much about a big emphasis is on education as a kind of personal formation. And I've found the language of intellectual virtues to be really useful way of fleshing that out. Similarly, a common Jesuit educational ideal is educating for the whole person. What does that mean? Well, I think this language can be really useful for fleshing that out. In another context, there might be a focus on critical thinking, right? Again, what does that mean? Certainly, it involves certain skills, but we normally think of this idea of being a critical thinker as important and as involving something more volitional, personal, agential, or characterological. So I think looking at what are the institution, looking at the mission and values of an institution and seeing whether there's alignment, whether there is alignment with sort of intellectual character and intellectual virtues, and there almost always will be, because it's the very rare educational organization, I would wager, that doesn't say something about wanting to cultivate lifelong learners or inspire a love of learning or critical thinkers and so on. But looking for connections with the mission and values of the university, and then maybe asking, are there certain virtues that stand out as especially important given those institutional values and concern. So that would be another way to kind of go about it.
This connects really nicely to another question we have, which is related to the buy-in of the faculty and the mission, the institution overall, administration. So you mentioned at the beginning of the talk something like, we all know that for some people, the moral virtues are quite controversial to bring into the classroom. Some people want to do it and some people don't. But
Yeah.
you were saying it seemed like, look, everybody who's doing this university thing has some connection with the kinds of things we're talking about with the intellectual virtues.
Mhm.
Does that mean something different for what we need from the administration, from faculty? Do we need explicit buy-in? Do we need to connect it explicitly to the mission? Do we need to be doing something intentionally that's sort of unified across the campus? What if we have an administration that seems opposed to virtue being introduced into the curriculum? Can we still do it under the radar? How do we think about the
Yeah.
importance of
Yeah.
buy-in when we're doing intellectual virtues?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, I do want to be clear that educating for intellectual virtues is not an all or nothing thing, right? It's something that we can do in more and fewer ways to a greater or lesser extent. But obviously, in the best case scenario, we'd be able to kind of maximize impact. And and really we would have institutional support, and we would have at least a cohort of colleagues who are invested in the same sort of endeavor. So I do think that we should seek that kind of institutional support and collaboration across departments, across colleagues. I think that can all be really useful and sustaining and invigorating. Um, but I don't think that all of those pieces have to be in place in order for us to begin sort of moving in the right direction. So I do think there's a lot that each of us can do through a kind of inventory of our own practices and values and a willingness to experiment and introduce new strategies and practices. Um, and I can tell you, these aren't, of course, these are very difficult things to measure the effectiveness of, but I can tell you in virtually all of my undergraduate courses, I have a sort of a module on intellectual virtues and intellectual character. I mean, I tell my students from day one that one of the goals of this course, in addition to a kind of knowledge and skills goal, is for you um, to have opportunities to reflect on your own intellectual character and to kind of, for me to create space for them to practice the virtues of good thinking. So I build it into the syllabus, build it into an explicit module in the course, which I don't think you have to do, but I will say that I have, years and years of feedback from students on course evaluations many of whom say, oh, the best part of the course was that
Mhm.
intellectual virtues stuff. Or I'll bump into students on campus who will say, I'm still thinking about that part of your course. So I think there is a power in this, in the language, a power in the ideas. And then, of course, I think there's something invigorating about learning in ways that involve the practice of intellectual virtues. And that's all stuff that we can do as individual instructors with our students over the course of a semester or a year. Better if others are doing it, better if the institution supports it, but those other supports aren't, I don't think, essential to make it, at least to make it worthwhile.
We're almost at the end, but let me try to sneak in one more quick one. Do you think at all about intellectual virtues and co-curricular programming? What place do they have outside the classroom? Or do you think of this as mostly an academic
Yeah.
pursuit?
Well, I think the right kind of co-curricular programming can also be a great support. So if you're at a, I mean, one of the remarkable things about the Intellectual Virtues Academy, I mean, the remarkable opportunity we had was to design the whole school around this educational approach and philosophy. So it's in the DNA of the school. And you see that in the language that's used at the school, the kinds of parent-teacher conferences that are given, what back to school night looks like at the school, what professional development looks like at the school, the sort of behavioral management model. I mean, it's everywhere, but it's not everywhere explicitly. And so I think that's important because I do think, I mean, especially at a place like the Intellectual Virtues Academy, students can grow tired if we're just talking about virtues, 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 especially if they're middle schoolers like they are in this case. Like whatever you tell them is important, they're going to think is not important. So you have to be subtle. So that's why I would say, I would never I would never recommend, I would always recommend the kind of structural integration of a focus on intellectual virtues over a co-curricular program. So I would hate to see intellectual, I think it would be unfortunate if teaching for intellectual virtues at a given school was just a matter of a kind of virtue of the month thing that comes out in a newsletter that gets talked
Yeah,
about at an assembly, right?
right.
But that's not to say that those things can't be valuable. They're just not a substance for the kind of deeper, whether structural or in a given classroom, the sort of deeper mechanisms that we can use to help nurture progress or growth in some of these qualities. So I
Right.
would say good idea, but it's not the main thing. And be thoughtful about how you do it because you don't want people to grow tired of the language.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate all you have to say. This was enormously informative and really interesting. And so thank you for joining us. And we hope to see all the rest of you at our next webinar in a month or so. Okay,
My
thanks,
pleasure.
everybody.
Thank
Have a
you
good
very
day.
much. Okay, cheers.